Events, as Ted always said, were necessary to change the psychology of society, and events are moving very fast now. Events are moving with breathtaking speed, both in Britain and particularly on a world scale. Now, if I would have said 12 months ago that you'd have a situation where Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, Merrill Lynch, Goldman Sachs, and Morgan Stanley would all be bankrupt, and that Gordon Brown and George Bush were nationalising the banks, I think, to put it mildly, that the commies would have been a little bit surprised. And it is astonishing. Sometimes events move so fast that you can't even grasp, you can't get your head around what is occurring. What is occurring is an absolute economic, social and political earthquake without parallel since the 1930s. Incidentally, they steadfastly, all the bourgeois and the economists steadfastly denied that there was any possibility of a slump, never mind a deep slump, never mind about a depression, never mind about 1929. Now they all say that the debate now is not whether there's going to be a recession. There is a recession. The debate is whether it's going to be a deep recession or a depression. I don't quite know what the difference is. It's a semantic thing, as far as I can see. But in any case, that's the position. It is a veritable earthquake which is impossible, the consequences of which is impossible to overstate. And by the way, there's a danger here for the older comrades. Sometimes when you repeat a certain prediction of a slump and so on, and the perspective is delayed, has been delayed for certain reasons which we will explain in a moment, the danger is that when it actually occurs, comrades are a bit blasé. They don't know what's happening. They don't grasp what's happening. What's happening is the perspective which we've been pointing out for many years. And it's quite amusing in this situation. I can't resist this. It's amusing to see the absolute ridiculous contortions of all the so-called economists, the professional economists. President Truman once said that war is too serious to be left to the generals. I would say economics is too serious to be left to the economists to see. They're all saying exactly the opposite of what they said for the last 20 or 30 years. It's quite amusing. We've entitled a little bit of Schadenfreude, as the Germans put it. The bourgeois economists understood nothing and foresaw nothing. It's a fact. It's a simple, empirically verifiable fact. They did not foresee, for the last 30 years, they have not made a single correct prediction. They didn't predict any of the slumps. For that matter, they didn't predict the booms either. It's absolute bankruptcy of these so-called scientific gentlemen. Let's recall, and I think we should rub their noses in it, by the way. They're keeping silent now, stumm. They don't like to talk about this anymore. Let's remind ourselves of the NEP, not Lenin's NEP, of course, but the so-called new economic paradigm. Paradigm, as you probably know, is what the scientists say. It's the word they use when they don't know what they're talking about. The new economic paradigm, that there was not supposed to be any more slumps. Well, they said this. This is the received wisdom, expressed, of course, brilliantly by our friend Gordon Brown. He talked about the end of boom and bust. Well, the boom is now well and truly finished, and Britain is well and truly bust. And that's a simple fact. Let's recall also that they talked for 30 years. And they braid out this nonsense. They're all opposed to regulation. No regulation. That was going to be the secret of success. The philosopher's stone. Deregulation. Markets must be deregulated. You remember this? They made a bonfire of all financial regulation, specifically for the financial sector. We had the so-called Big Bang. When was it? 86? Something like that. 1980s. Now they're all calling for regulation. Regulate, must regulate, must regulate. The argument was the state must not intervene. The state must stay out of it. Laissez-faire. Now Osborne, the Tory vice minister or whatever it is, Chancellor, said in the and he didn't even blink, he didn't even blush when he said it. And he said it in the House of Commons, laissez-faire is dead. He said this, without so much as blinking. The state or the government is not supposed to intervene. Well, now they're pleading for the government to intervene, and they're compelled to allow the government to intervene. I can't resist this quote from the current edition of The Economist, which the comments could read. I'll show you that. Just out of interest, just have a look at the covers of the last Economist. I don't have time to read the Financial Times, except occasionally. I've looked at one or two recent, unfortunately. There's a lot of very good stuff in the FT. Just look at the last few Economists. September the 27th, I want your money. Picture of Poulsen. And the subhead is, will Poulsen's plan work? Next edition, October the 4th. World on the edge is a picture of a man, I think you can see it standing on more than on the edge of a cliff. He's about to fall off. By the way, inside there's a cartoon of Sarkozy reading Das Kapital. October the 11th, saving the system. Here's a picture of the world which is collapsing. The world is in free fall. And it says, the panic, the rescues, and a special report on the world economy, about which they're justifiably concerned. And last but not least, the current issue, which you may not have seen, I don't know if you can make out the picture, Capitalism at Bay, it says, and there's a picture from an Assyrian frieze, which you find in the British Museum, of a lion being shot to bits by arrows. And it's a moribund lion. The editorial of this current edition says the following, I quote, in the short term, they don't define their terms, in the short term, defending capitalism means, paradoxically, state intervention. This is The Economist, which for the last 20 or 30 years has been conducting a loud campaign, a noisy campaign against this. And then they console themselves with the following winged phrases. And capitalism, eventually, they never define the time span, and capitalism eventually corrects itself. After a crisis, it says, investors seldom make the same mistake twice. Like a drunken man after a wild party, saying that you never drink, you signed the pledge, I'll never do this again. Of course, they always say the same thing after every crisis, and then they proceed to repeat precisely the same mistakes as what they've done in the past. Capitalism eventually corrects itself, it says. Of course, Keynes had the perfect answer to that, which you all remember. In the long run, said Keynes, we're all dead. And of course, the question is, they argue now about a correction, thinking that the word correction sounds a bit more decent than a slump or a recession or anything like that. A correction. They say, well, I suppose in a sense it is a correction. It will be a very severe correction because of the severe distortions which they introduced in the last period. What they don't say is that a correction under these circumstances will have the most severe consequences, and that's what we must do. We must keep your eye on the ball. It's okay to discuss the theory of economics, which we must do, of course, but you must see the effects of it. That's the point. The effect in consciousness. Human consciousness, we explained many times in terms of Marxist dialectical materialism, is not a progressive thing. It lags behind events. Under normal circumstances, that's the case. Human consciousness, I think this goes back to very primitive times, the remnant of a primitive psychology. People don't like change. People in general do not like change. They cling to the old traditional ideas, habits, familiar political parties, institutions, and so on. They don't normally question these institutions. They're accustomed to them. This is like a self-defense, psychological self-defense mechanism. Yes, that's normally the case. But there are certain circumstances, this is pure dialectics. You can have many years where things go ticking along quite nicely. Then suddenly society reaches a critical point, to use an expression of the physicists, in which things turn into the opposite. Now, that's what we must grasp. Everything turns in its opposite. I'll try to demonstrate in the course of the read of how economically things have turned into the opposite. But more important for us, 1,000 times more important, is how the consciousness of the working class, and not just the working class, the bourgeois, the middle class, also turn into its opposite, on the basis of the hammer blows of events. You get a jolt. The jolt might be a war, as happened in 1914. Or it might be an economic catastrophe, because this is an economic catastrophe. a very serious state of affairs, also jolts people out of the complacency, out of the apathy. The old apathy is gone now. Everyone's discussing. People that didn't discuss politics or economics took no interest in the workings of the stock exchange. It all seemed a bit arcane. And now you have in every bus stop, in every marketplace, in the barber shop, wherever, in the pub, what are people talking about? They're talking about this. That in itself is a fundamental change in the situation which this tendency must take on board. Oh, then of course we have our Gordon, the hero of the hour, Gordon Brown. I was just thinking, there's a phrase in Bertolt Brecht's play, The Life of Galilei, where Andreas said, "Unhappy is the land that has no heroes," and Galileo says, "No, unhappy is the land that needs heroes." And by God, triply unhappy is a land that's got to have a hero like Gordon Brown, for God's sake. A most unlikely knight in shining armour, who's now being compared to Churchill and Roosevelt and the Dunkirk spirit in his finest hour, and so on and so forth. You see how long this will last. From zero to hero, they said. Well, it will soon be from hero to zero, when it becomes evident that all the so-called solutions of Brown are no solutions at all. Although apparently it's very popular in Europe at the moment. Hitherto they didn't like to listen to Brown. He's such a boring speaker, and didn't often turn up to meetings, but then he left early anyway. It was treated like everywhere else, was treated with a figure of him. Now I think that no old age Testament prophet has been listened to with such rapt attention as Gordon Brown has got. I suppose when you've got no ideas of your own, to anyone that seems to have half an idea, obviously somebody to listen. What are the ideas of Brown for solving the banking problem? Point number one, transparency. Yes, the word capitalist financial system got as transparent as a cesspool. Second, integrity. The bankers must now have integrity. They have as much integrity as a mafia convention. And responsibility. They must be responsible. They never have been responsible in the past, but they must be responsible now. Not as responsible as elapsed members of Alcoholics Anonymous. Empty words. And these empty words are put up as a brilliant solution, of course, and throwing tons of money. You know, since the banks are essential to the capitalist system, you throw tons of money at them. We'll come to the amount of money in a moment. Throw tons of money and the bankers will be happy, and then they will invest. And then they will start lending to each other, and then the problem will be solved. Even Lula then, this is everywhere. Lula in Brazil says the same thing. He says that we need to combat the anarchy of capitalism. He's just woken up to the fact that capitalism is anarchic. Yes, but